Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today, and we're carrying on with our Stuart's Britain module. We're looking at Charles I and his monarchy, and in this video, we're going to be focusing on the failure of his initial monarchical government in the first few years of his reign between 1625 and 1629. If you haven't already, make sure you've gone back and checked out our two background videos on this where we did the build up into the 1600s, what was happening in Britain before Charles came to the throne, and also a bit of the religious tension that was occurring and all the divisions that had been left behind for him after the reign of his father, James VI. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. We've already looked at some of the religious background and divisions that were what Charles was going to inherit. And the main thing was his father had left him a country, is already wary of a Scottish monarch ruling over England, and also the divisions that are in England at this time, especially on the grounds of division. This one is going to look at the failures with his government in those initial years. The religious tension will be mentioned. There'll be a further video coming out for you that will explore that. It's quite a lot to cover, and this video tied in with everything else won't necessarily do it justice. So there's four key questions we have to consider as we look at the monarchical government and what's happening in the years 1625 to 1629. First off, what are the key events? What's happening during the reign of Charles here? What tensions are there in Parliament? What's happening between him and the Crown? And what exactly is going to occur for him? How exactly does he manage these issues and how exactly does he react to the situation around him? We're going to find the relation between Crown and Parliament becomes strained in this time, but there's reasons why that happens, and we're going to explore what exactly those reasons are. What causes this to happen? And as a consequence, how does Charles react to that and maybe make the situation a little bit worse? We're also going to see how his relationship with Parliament differs from James I and how exactly he reacts differently to how his father did, and particularly in terms of his attitude of Parliament that he faces with them. And then lastly, we're going to consider who was most at fault for the decline in relation between Crown and Parliament. The two sides of every story. We have the Crown's actions regarding what Charles himself did, but also did Parliament do something that maybe justified Charles's reaction, and maybe did they actually cause relation to become strained more than what Charles was doing? So let's jump into our history and find out exactly what happened. So first off, a quick reminder about James' relations with Parliament, because it's good to bear this in mind. This is why we did the background video and the background knowledge, because we can see how Charles changes or maybe misinterprets stuff that his father was doing. So first off, he was a firm believer in the divine right of king, which means that James very much believed that he was God on earth, that he had the most amount of power in all of England and Scotland, and therefore it was his right to, of course, exercise that power and therefore control what Parliament and others did. He often had vast influence over religion, especially. The English Parliament, as we also said, struggled to work with a Scottish king, while of course the kingdoms were united under the reign of one monarch. Again, it was still quite tense. Scotland, as we're going to see, is very different to how England is, and therefore the relation between them has some natural tension. He also collected tonnage and poundage for life, but that came to regret doing so, and he didn't like taking the money. He left Parliament always in debt to him, and always caused tension with proroguing. But James always wanted to take a middle ground and try and reduce tensions where he could. This is why, when Parliament wanted a Protestant foreign policy, James kind of contradicted this and sought peace with the Catholics in Spain. He wanted to keep the kingdoms out of the religious war that was happening in Europe, the whole what would actually escalate into the 30 Years' War. And towards the end of his reign, there was also some suspicion from Parliament with James's last favourite, George Villiers, later the Duke of Buckingham. He especially had begun transferring his influence toward Charles, so many in Parliament were very wary that maybe this favourite, this George Villiers, was going to have an impact, but was in some ways the true through line between James and Charles's reign, were certainly puppet figures that George could influence. So let's find out exactly what Charles does in his reign. So first off, it's good to be aware about Charles's own character. He's a fair bit different to his father. He's a bit more reserved, and it's worth mentioning that his brother initially, who's tragically died, was actually meant to be the one who was going to succeed James. So it was quite interesting that then Charles has to take the reign and instead become the king instead. He already shows some sympathies that kind of go beyond what his father was doing. Particularly, he took the Duke of Buckingham's advice and had arranged a marriage with Henrietta Maria from France. She was a Catholic, which already stirred a lot of religious tension in Parliament, because Parliament, as we said, were very much Protestant, even Puritan led in their religious influence. And so to see the king openly marry a Catholic woman, and even more so bring her to England and allow her to carry on her Catholic practices, was very much seen as, but in their eyes, quite sinful to disgrace the monarchy as he was doing. We're going to get more into religion and the impact of this, but it's worth bearing in mind Charles's own family life is already drawing out a lot of concerns among Parliament itself. He also was indeed under the influence of Buckingham. The man had been a bit of a mentorship figure towards Charles, and seen as an older brother for him to rely on, him to get advice from. And so Charles was very much influenced by what the Duke was advising, and of course saw him as the last link to his late father, and therefore was very much receptive to what he was doing. He quite liked him, and they shared a good relationship in the royal courts. So let's get ourselves into Charles's actual reign, and we're starting with what's called the Useless Parliament, which began on June 1625 to raise money. Why was this happening? Well, Charles became king in March 1625. He found the monarchy his father had left had very little cash available. Usually, this could be solved by the act of borrowing, but Charles could not convince enough people to lend the government money. He did manage to raise £60,000 from the City of London merchants, but he needed much more funds to come from an institution that should provide him money, which was Parliament. So, in June 1625, he called the Parliament with the intention of raising this money he wanted. This Parliament was only going to last for 3 months, and its nickname became the Useless Parliament, as Charles himself decreed it. Tensions already began because Parliament had expressed their issues with the Duke of Buckingham, believing he was misleading the king and actually wanting him to get embroiled in these wars in Europe that James had tried his best to mitigate during his reign. It didn't help, as we already said, they were distrustful of Henrietta Maria, who Duke of Buckingham had a big hand in arranging Charles to marry. So already before they're even talking about actual policy, Parliament are very much already very agitated with the interactions with Charles in Parliament itself. Charles has also become resentful because, unlike with his father, the House of Commons refused to grant Charles the right to collect the custom duties and taxes for life, the tonnage and poundage that was a right James had had for his entire reign. And instead, the MPs decided they wanted to grant it for just 1 year and then review if it actually was needed. Would they need to keep collecting money through tonnage and poundage? This would ensure the king had to call Parliament regularly rather than just calling them now, collecting loads of money and never seeing them again. Charles, seeing himself disgraced in this position, refused and saw the position that the House of Commons with the politician that the MPs had took was a downright insult to him and his reign. It's worth noting in the historical context, this was the first time Parliament had ever refused this traditional grant to a monarch. So already the tension was clear. It's worth considering. Were Parliament already doing something that was causing Charles to be agitated, and therefore they were going to create the consequences of their fractured relationship for time to come? As we've also mentioned as well, religion was another thing that was on their mind with Henrietta Maria. She had brought a group of Catholic advisors to England when she married Charles, and therefore he was seeing himself as quite sympathetic to allow her to have more ceremonies and symbolism in the Anglican Church. We will touch more on that, as I say. Buckingham had negotiated the marriage contract, and the MPs became furious when it transpired that as part of the marriage deal, English ships would be used to suppress a Protestant rebellion that was happening in France. It was very clear to Parliament that therefore Charles was intending to wage war in Europe and was just going to use their money to fund this war effort. They kept refusing, and they even actually were some talks of even impeaching the Duke of Buckingham. This is quite a severe thing to do because you impeach a member of the royal court, putting them on trial. You were therefore accusing them of going against the crown. And in Charles's eyes, Buckingham was one of his closest advisors and one of the last favourites of his own father, the prior King James. This was an absolute disgrace and was angering Charles behind the scenes. Alas, as it was clear that supply of money would not be forthcoming, Charles dissolved the Parliament, and indeed it was useless. So time passes on. The Parliament remains closed, and continues to enact the war efforts that the Duke of Buckingham was recommending him. In November 1625, an English naval expedition to Cadiz in Spain, but it ended in humiliating failure. Buckingham had chose the commander of the expedition. Frankly, he made a complete mistake. The MPs had a point of criticism that Charles had allowed Buckingham to engage in this war without true proper planning and an unwillingness to attend to detail and unrealistic expectations of what could really be achieved when these foreign policies were becoming so disastrous. Charles then decided to call his second parliament in February 1626, still in dire need of the money that he now definitely needed because of how bad the war effort was going. But Parliament had other ideas. They targeted the Duke of Buckingham, who they saw as responsible for the problems the country was now facing, again, only a year into Charles's reign. Many of Buckingham's enemies joined in the attempt to now outright impeach him. This would, as we said, send him put on trial and possibly executed. The criticism was open, and the money Charles desired was not going to be provided. To save his friend and advisor from execution, Charles once again used his powers to dissolve Parliament without getting that key financial support he truly wanted. Parliament was closed, but the wars in Europe continued on, and Buckingham continued his campaigns. He truly was shown to be inept in his war planning, though. England was at war with the two most powerful countries, Spain and France. Although Buckingham did want to help the Protestants in France, particularly sending a siege of ships to La Rochelle in 1627, this too also failed because of his poor planning. As complaints about Buckingham grew and grew, Charles realized he would get no money from Parliament unless he sacrificed his closest advisor. However, he was a strong believer in the divine right of kings like his father was, and he therefore became extremely angry that Parliament was holding one of his own advisors, who in his eyes had been chosen through the eyes of God, to account for all the failures that were happening in Europe. So Charles decided he was going to govern according to his own rules. He wasn't going to take advice from Parliament at all. He was going to do what he desired. And so two things came from this. He therefore began using the military to force the collecting of tonnage and poundage without parliamentary approval. And he also began demanding a forced loan. The forced loan was a request from the king for a loan that would never be repaid, that could not be refused, because he was using his divine right. Charles threatened anyone who refused to pay the fee with imprisonment or conscription into the army to fight in Europe. The forced loan created huge resentment throughout the country. MPs began to worry that the king was going law and order in England, and therefore was actually turning into something more of a tyrannical ruler. This escalated later in 1627 when a group of 5 gentlemen, who became known as the 5 Knights, challenged the king's right to imprison them. This is also called the Darnell's case, as the lead man Darnell led the disputes in court. Charles used his divine right of kings to pressure the court into imprisoning the men. This seemed to suggest the king indeed was denying the rule of law and laying a foundation for tyranny that they had feared. And so we reach 1628 when Charles once again decides to call Parliament to collect more money because the funds he had still weren't enough. This time, the MPs knew if they just simply attacked Buckingham, the king would dissolve Parliament and they'd be back to where they were before. No progress, and Charles getting more and more tyrannical and controlling. So, they allowed the experienced lawyer Sir Edward Coke to propose a petition of right to Charles instead. It was a very carefully worded document, which made it seem as though Parliament were asking the king for help to define the law rather than insisting he follow what they wanted to say. Some of the key things they asked for in it were to reverse the 5 Knights and Darnell's case, that there should be no more forced loans, restore what's called habeas corpus, the right to a fair trial, which the men in the Darnell's case had not been granted, to no longer allow billeting, which is where civilian houses have been used by soldiers to live in during the war efforts, and in return for Charles agreeing to it, they would give him 5 subsidies of taxation, a hell of a lot of cash. This was really quite clever. By asking for the king's help to correct and clarify the law, Parliament were not accusing Charles of making any mistakes and showed outward respect for his monarchy. Charles, therefore, decided to accept their demands. Perhaps now, with both sides somewhat partially satisfied, there was a chance that Charles and Parliament's relationship could become more harmonious and no longer a strain. After all, Charles now had the much needed money he desired, and Parliament had managed to actually get Charles to limit some of his power, keeping Parliament open. However, Parliament made one key blunder. They issued something called a remonstrance, which is basically a list of their grievances with Charles's rule, because although they had come to some sort of compromise, Charles was still going to war under Buckingham's direction with Europe. They decided to blame the people of Buckingham directly for their miseries with the foreign war and the economic decline they were facing. However, this caused a man called John Felton to become inspired by their words. He believed that Buckingham was indeed the cause of all of England's miseries, and when he had a chance meeting with Buckingham in a public house in Portsmouth, he decided to assassinate Buckingham himself, killing him in a brawl in the bar. With his death, many MPs believed Charles would now make wiser decisions with Villiers no longer there to influence him. However, this loss would actually devastate Charles over his friend's death. And when Charles went into Parliament to see the MPs celebrating and openly excited that Villiers had died, Charles became personally angered and full of revenge for these MPs, believing they did indeed have a hand in his close friend's death. He decided to take ownership of these policies, especially tonnage and poundage, and continue collecting it without their approval, and even imprison more merchants who refused to pay it. So when Parliament reassembled in January 1629, there was much suspicion and mistrust. The MPs saw that now Charles was breaching the petition of right they had all agreed upon. The frustrated king decided to prorogue Parliament one more time. The MPs ignored his calls to disperse, and they physically held the Speaker in his chair to keep the House of Commons in session to pass 3 more resolutions. These were against the growth of Arminianism, the collection of tonnage and poundage, and the punishments for those who were not paying it. Angered by the defiance of the MPs, Charles escalated and dissolved the Parliament and declared he would not call another Parliament until his subjects would have a better understanding between him and themselves. This marked a dramatic breakdown between the king and Parliament, and therefore the system of government. So why did Parliament and the monarchy actually fall out? Well, it all started with the distrust of Charles' advisors, especially the Duke of Buckingham. Parliament had been wary of him from the very beginning, didn't like how influential he was over Charles, and believed the decisions he was calling him to make were very disruptive and simply bad. Consequently, they felt justified by this because then the foreign policy the Duke made Charles commit to went terribly. The fighting in Spain at Cadiz was a failure, La Rochelle was an embarrassment in France, and so Parliament felt justified in refusing to raise the money for Charles the entire time, even though Charles was right to point out they had willingly done this for his father only a couple of years prior. From all of this, fears of what would be called an absolute monarchy became more pronounced because the forced loans and suspending of habeas corpus, in addition to now the complete suspension of Parliament, convinced many MPs that Charles was taking a more tyrannical turn rather than a more cooperative turn, as James had done. Some even believed that Charles was trying to destroy Parliament as an institution and govern by himself. Indeed, as we'll see, we're going to find ourselves exploring what's called the 11-year tyranny in the aftermath of this closing of Parliament and see how Charles coped without Parliament by his side for the next 11 years. But one thing, as I've been saying throughout this video, we've not gave too much attention to is the impact of religion on their relationships. Because we can look at this from an outside perspective and say, oh, it's the advisors, it's the economic problems, it's the foreign policy, and Charles's own stubbornness. But what if there was one issue that was combining all of this together that stemmed this distrust between Parliament and Charles before they even managed to start? After all, why were they treating Charles like this from the beginning when with James they were much more cooperative? And that's going to have something to do with religion, and that is going to be what we're exploring in our next video on this series. Thank you as always for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this quite useful in your studies and you've learned something more. Any questions, comments, and queries, do make sure you put down in the comments section below. I'll make sure to give any advice and read through them as always. But I hope you'll be tuning in for our next video as we explore religion and the impact that had between Parliament and monarchy in this time period. So this has been History with Sire, and thank you for listening.